Welcome to a Cicero Talk. Actually, we might be celebrating right now because this year marks the 200th anniversary of what might be the most iconic monster in modern mythology. In 1818, Mary Shelley published her story about Frankenstein's monster. And although not all of you will actually have read her book, we still all know Frankenstein's monster. I can still clearly see Boris Karloff as the monster, with his square head, his drooping eyes, and his strange metal bolts sticking from his neck. Now, when Mary wrote her story, she had clearly been inspired by a long tradition of creature myths. Like, for example, about 200 years before, there had been Rabbi Löw in Prague, who had created from clay this humanoid figure, which he'd called Golem. Now, the golem had come to life, and the golem had started to roam the streets of Prague at night to protect the Jewish people. Now, of course, in that story, something goes awfully wrong, and the golem goes on a rampage and starts to kill people, and it has to be taken care of. The monster has to be killed. Further back in classical antiquity, there had been Pygmalion, who, when looking for the ideal wife, had decided to create his own perfect woman, just for himself. And he'd made a statue. And he'd been very successful because the statue turned out to be ravishingly beautiful. Even so beautiful that he, Pygmalion, fell in love with the statue, fell in love with his own creation. Now, luckily for the poor man, Venus, Aphrodite, the goddess of love herself, took pity on him and turned the inanimate object into an actual living woman. And even further back, there had been Prometheus, who had dared to steal the fire of heaven from the gods themselves. And he'd given it to man right at the start of civilization. Now, of course, he should never have done that, because the fire of heaven was the fire of creation, was the fire of life, which clearly is the domain of the gods. So Zeus, the most important of the Greek gods, got very angry, and he had Prometheus thrown into the underworld, had him chained to a rock, and every day a bird would come and pick out the liver from Prometheus' side. The liver would grow back, and the bird would come back, and would go on and on and on. And it's probably still going on today, because it was an eternal punishment. Now, when Mary wrote her story, she hadn't been all that original, but still, what we can see is that from that moment on, the moment of publication of that story in 18, the creature myth, the theme of the monster, occurs more frequently in popular culture. Like, for example, there was this Italian author who called himself Collodi, who wrote a story about the old man Geppetto, who made this wooden puppet in the form of a young boy, and he called the puppet Pinocchio. The puppet came to life, turned into a real boy. And at the end of Collodi's original story, this Pinocchio, this real boy, is hanged for his crimes. Again, the monster has to be killed. And then there was George Bernard Shaw, who wrote his play Pygmalion, clearly referring back to the original myth, but this time with a twist. Because in the Shaw story, the Pygmalion character, Professor Higgins, changes this actual young woman, this rather vulgar young woman, Eliza Doolittle, into this beautiful society lady. And the play led to the musical. The musical led to the movie, My Fair Lady. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen My Fair Lady with Audrey Hepburn as Eliza Doolittle. But even if you haven't, perhaps you still know that in that movie, that story, there is this one crucial scene, the actual moment when Eliza speaks, for the first time, speaks these famous words. The rain in Spain stay mainly in the plain. Now, if you watch that movie again, pay close attention to that scene, that particular scene. There, Audrey is on a sofa. They're in this library, and Professor Higgins and his friend, they're arguing because they're about to give up on Audrey. They no longer believe that this girl will ever be able to speak these words without a thick Cockney accent. And take a good look at Audrey. she's on the sofa. She's completely expressionless. It's as if she's frozen in time. She's not paying attention to anything that goes on around her. And then suddenly, she opens her mouth and out come these perfect words, and she turns to the man and repeats the words. And well, that's when Higgins starts to shout, "I think she's got it. I think she's got it." Now that is the director's touch. That's Audrey Hepburn referring back to the original Pygmalion myth, where the inanimate statue comes to life. That's the actual moment of transformation. Transformation, which the Greeks would call metamorphosis. And Metamorphosis, of course, was the title of Ovid's book, the Roman poet Ovid, the 1st century before Christ. The Metamorphosis. And one of the main stories in the Metamorphosis is the original Pygmalion myth. Transformation, metamorphosis, or what we today would call extreme makeovers. Now, the theme of transformation occurs more and more frequently in other movies as well, and plays. And one of the most obvious examples would be Pretty Woman. Remember that movie, Pretty Woman, with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere? I mean, even the title gives it away. My Fair Lady, Pretty Woman. Now, of course, in that movie, Julia Roberts, as the vulgar young woman, now an actual prostitute, changes into this beautiful society lady. And Richard Gere plays the Higgins part in that story. But apart from this aspect, this theme of transformation, I think there's another aspect to the creature myths as well. Let's turn back to Mary, because there is more to the monster than just the transformation. And it's a darker and gloomier aspect. Now for that, let's turn to science fiction. Perhaps the most famous of all science fiction writers of the 20th century would be Isaac Asimov. Now, Asimov wrote this story, The Bicentennial Man, which was turned into a movie with the late, great Robin Williams as a robot. Because in that story, somebody has built a robot, and the robot gets this positronic brain, as it is called in that story. And that means that the robot becomes autonomous, starts to think for himself, cherish his own dreams and have his own ambitions. And throughout that story, we see the robot exchange more and more of his machine body parts for actual human body parts. And right at the end of the story, it's called Bicentennial Man. It takes the robot 200 years to reach that point, to take the final step. And we see the robot actually exchanging his immortal positronic computer brain for an actual human brain. Which of course means that the robot will die. But that's its final triumph, because in dying it has finally become human. And then there's the other science fiction author, Philip K. Dick, who wrote his story, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was turned into Blade Runner, the movie with Harrison Ford and Rutger Hauer. Remember that final scene where Rutger has this one burning desire? He wants to be treated as a human, not as a machine or as the android, which he actually is. And perhaps you've seen more recently, you've seen this British movie, Ex Machina, where once again this young man falls in love with this ravishingly stunning female android. And Ex Machina, the title, is of course short for this famous Latin phrase, Deus Ex Machina, the God from the machine. And then there is the HBO series Westworld, where one of the major premises is that it's hardly possible to distinguish between the android, which they call host in that series, between the android and the actual human. The only way to make sure is by killing it, because when it comes back from the repair shop, it's an android. If it stays dead, it's a human. Now this theme of creation, of life and death, it even occurs in comedy. remember that 80s movie, Weird Science? Now, in Weird Science, Anthony Michael Hall and his friend decide to create the perfect girlfriend for themselves. It's Pygmalion all over again. Only because it's an 80s movie, they use a computer to do that. And they rig up this enormous computer. And right at the moment when they're about to create this monster, the computer threatens to overload and explode. And right at that moment, lightning strikes. Lightning hits the circuitry, and that gives the final push and enables them to actually create the perfect girlfriend. And their very own monster, and it turns out to be ravishingly beautiful again. Because she is Kelly LeBrock. Now, if you watch that movie again, pay close attention to that scene as well. That crucial scene when the computer is huffing and puffing and everything is chaos and panic. And right before lightning strikes, the director has spliced in all sorts of cameos, bits and pieces from other movies, from newsreel footage, whatever. And there's this brief scene, this black and white movie of an actor, very agitated, shouting out, "It's alive! It's alive!" Well, that, of course, is the actor playing Dr. Frankenstein in the original Boris Karloff movie. Right before lightning strikes, and Boris eventually opens his eyes. Because it's lightning once again. Fire of heaven, it's fire of creation, it's fire of life. That's the reason for this strange metal bolts in Boris's neck. That's where the fire of life enters the dead body and brings it to life. And that's what Prometheus was all about. And that's why Mary's book is actually entitled Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. So I do think we should be celebrating right now, because Mary's monster has turned 200 years old. Now there's a reason to celebrate if ever there was one. But the real monster is much older than that. The real monster is as old as mankind itself. Whether it's the Golem, or Boris Karloff, or Robin Williams, or Kelly LeBrock, whatever the monster does is change its outward appearance, because every age brings forth its very own monster. The real question of the creature myth, the real question the monster puts to us is, what does it mean to be human? What's it like? What does it take? Which translates into the most difficult question ever. Who am I? And that's the existential, that's the universal question. No matter where, when, how, it always comes back to that one question. And that's because history is like a never-ending story. And whoever wrote that script made pretty sure that everything connects to everything else. See you next time on the Cicero Company channel.